Okay. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I think it's morning for most of us, even though it's different time zones. California, we have New York, we have Brazil. I'm not sure where else is going to be joining, whether live or whether accessing the recordings. So before we begin, let me just explain how it's going to work. This class was started by Nomi Ganevish, who has not joined yet, and Chaya Sarah. We had a class last week, but we're going to recap certain key concepts. It is not a text-based class. We are going to be taking concepts from Tanya in the order that they are in Tanya. So we're not going to be jumping around. We're going to be going in the order of the prakim of Tanya. And mainly we're going to be making it practical to enable us to apply it to our lives, not to let it be like this, like very abstract, these very abstract concepts. So it's going to be really a tools for life situation, this class, and it's going to last a half an hour. We are going to, in the coming weeks, we're going to start punctually, and hopefully everyone will enjoy. Okay, so basically, just to start, we need to be able to understand certain concepts. First of all, what is the purpose of Tanya? The purpose of Tanya is to explain to us that the service of God, Avodas Hashem, is an attainable goal. It is not something that we think that others do better. It is not something that we fulfill by rote. It is something that the Alter Rebbe, when he introduced Tanya to us, and on the title page, he used the words that Moshe Rabbeinu said to the nation of Israel when he was giving them his final farewell speech. He said to them, you should know that Torah is not in the heavens, it is not far from you. Ki karev elecha hadavar ma'od b'ficha uvelvavcha la'asosei. It is very close to you. It is not only close, it is very close. In other words, it is very accessible. It is attainable for each and every one of us to do. How? Bilvavcha, in our heart, meaning that it's not only sufficient that we serve God by doing the actions, but that we also serve God with feeling, with love and fear, and that we ourselves develop healthy emotions. And he uses the words beficha or bilvavcha la'asosei, in your mouth, in your heart, to do. So those are referring to the three expressions of the soul, which we will get into further at a later stage, which are thought, speech, and action. In a nutshell, Tanya addresses the dilemma between your actions and your values. Ideally, one wants to be aligned with your values, but it's very, very often that one has values and then one acts differently to those values. It's like, you want to go on a diet, but then you eat a piece of cake. And the dilemma is why. Tanya explains to us why, explains to us by explaining to us the structure of our souls. Always we know that when we have awareness is the precursor to choice. So we cannot choose to do the right thing if we don't know what's driving our choices. So Tanya, the beginning parts of Tanya, the first 9 chapters, actually let's break it up into even the first 4. The first 4 chapters, the first chapter will discuss our identity, who we are. The second chapter will discuss the second part of our identity, the divine soul. The third chapter of Tanya explains to us the structure of the souls. The fourth chapter goes into the expressions or garments of the soul, how we think, how we behave, how we act. And in actual fact, then Tanya goes into the struggle between the souls. After chapter 9, more or less, Tanya then examines what is the purpose of the struggle, because there is a purpose to the struggle. If Hashem would have wanted us not to have a struggle, he would have just given the Torah to the angels who sing his praises all day long and give him pleasure. However, there is a different purpose, which is why Hashem created the world in this way, with our 2 different souls and where they come from and what the purpose of that struggle is. Okay, and then in the last chapters, from around chapter 35 to 53, Tanya really explains how to resolve the struggle. Resolving the struggle is actually ongoing, but mainly from chapter 35 to 53. That's just in a nutshell. So to introduce, to understand the concepts in the first chapter and the second chapter, we are introduced to three different people in Tanya. We are introduced to the tzaddik, the Beinoni, and the Rasha. Now, normally, especially when it comes to judgment, we the tzaddik is someone who has majority mitzvahs. The Beinoni is someone who's like half mitzvahs, half averos, and the Rasha is someone who has majority sins and minority good deeds. However, Tanya turns all of that on its head. The Alter Rebbe turns all of that on its head and explains to us how we should look at these three people, not from actually a judgment perspective, as in how many mitzvahs or averos they actually have, but from their potential. In other words, who they can be versus who they are in actual fact. So just to recap, a tzaddik, we will get into the different structures of the souls, but we do know that each of us has two souls, which fuel ourselves. So first of all, just to before we describe these three different people, let's describe the souls that are within us. We do know that God created us with two souls. The animalistic soul, Tanya describes first. The reason that Tanya describes the animalistic soul first is because it actually enters your body first before your divine soul. The animal soul is what gives life to your body. It is found within your blood. It is actually what gives you your personality, your nature. It is called animalistic because it's kind of instinctual. So it always is in pursuit of pleasure, is in pursuit of what's comfortable for it and what comes easily to it. So that is what comes into your body first. That's why a baby will cry when it's hungry and cry when it's uncomfortable, because the baby only at that point has the beginning, the roots of the godly soul. And at that point, when a baby is born, it just wants to survive, just wants to be comfortable, just wants to have a pleasurable life. Similar to an animal, which an animal is also all about self-preservation, all about surviving, all about instinct. The animalistic soul is actually the main place of the animalistic soul is in the left ventricle of the heart. Tanya explains to us, and it is also the source of good traits, which might be the personality of a person, surprisingly enough, which is like if a person has Rahmanis, has pity on another person, or a person likes to do acts of goodness, but that's his nature. He didn't work on himself to overcome something which prevents him from doing good deeds. That's his nature. The animalistic soul is the source of those good traits, and also the source of negative traits, such as anger and pride, pursuit of pleasure, scoffing, frivolity, idle talk, melancholy, and laziness, for example. And we will understand why in just a moment. So the animal soul, to understand where it comes from and why it gives rise to negative traits, we have to understand three concepts. Those three concepts are Kedusha, the opposite of Kedusha, which is Klippa, and Klippas Noiga. Now, Kedusha is something in this world which reveals godliness. So when you do a mitzvah, you reveal godliness in this world. It is like a transparent window that lets the light shine through. Klippa, on the other hand, conceals godliness. It's like an opaque covering that you cannot see through, like a curtain, a thick curtain. It conceals godliness. It does not mean that godliness is not there, but the godliness is concealed, which is why Klippa is the force driving you to sin. Because when a person sins, he momentarily forgets that he is a part of God. He momentarily forgets that God is his life force and that God drives his every action. He momentarily thinks that he is independent from God because he doesn't see God. Klippa is something which conceals God. So he feels at that present moment that he's not connected with God, and therefore he sins. On the other hand, there is a category that is called klipas noiga. Klipas noiga is the origin of the animal soul in a Jew. Klipas noiga, on the one hand, has the word klipa in it, so it does conceal godliness to an extent. However, it is as if it's like a translucent covering. So like, like those windows, sometimes like on bathrooms or in different places, it's like you could see that there's a light behind the window, but you really can't see the light shining through completely. And that is the source of the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul in a Jew. It does conceal godliness, but godliness is easier revealed in this category. So in actions, so we've just said that mitzvahs reveal godliness, they are kedusha. Averos, sins, conceal godliness, and their source is klipa. On the other hand, there are a lot of permissible activities that we do, like sleeping and eating and walking and exercising and whatever else is permissible, working, whatever else we do. Those are permissible. Those are neither kedusha, godliness, or klipa, profanity, or whatever concealed negative forces, concealing godliness at their source. Being that those are permissible activities, their source is something called klipas noiga, meaning depending on your intention, and later on in Tanya, it goes more into details about that, about kavana behind these actions. Depending on your intention, these actions can either be elevated to the state of kedusha, or they can descend to the level of klipa, depending on your intention. So just to take food as an example, if you eat kosher food and you make a bracha on your food and you eat healthy food and you eat for the purpose of having energy to serve God, you have actually elevated your food at that point. It's become something holy. If you eat, on the other hand, junk and instinctively and just gluttonously and, God forbid, even non-kosher food, then that permissible activity has now descended into the level of pure klipa. So in other words, the category of klipas noiga, from where the animal soul in a Jew comes, is something that can be manipulated to either be holy or to be unholy, which is why we are going to see, when we get into what the animal soul is, and how we can actually subjugate the animal soul to become an ally to the divine soul, it is able to be easily done in a Jew because of this characteristic. The origin is klipa, yes, but it is not complete and utter concealment of godliness. There is a translucence over there, and therefore we can take our animal soul and become what is known as a Beinoni of Tanya. Now, to understand what is the Beinoni of Tanya, we will describe the tzaddik, the rasha, and the Beinoni, and understand what is the whole objective of Tanya in this respect. Now, since we know that we have two souls, since we know that each of us have two souls, in the tzaddik and the Beinoni look very, very similar on the outside. The tzaddik has completely transformed his animal soul. In other words, his animal soul is not an obstacle for the tzaddik. In regular people such as ourselves, and in a rasha, in a Beinoni, the animal soul can be an obstacle in the service of God. However, in the tzaddik, that animal soul has become completely transformed into godliness. Now, if you remember in the beginning of the class, I mentioned that the animal soul is generally found in the left ventricle of the heart. Now, the heart has two ventricles. There's the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Although Tanya will go into it more in detail in future chapters, the way that it has transformed the animal soul in a tzaddik is that the love of God, because love is an emotion which is found in the heart, the love of God in a tzaddik, which is found in the right ventricle of the heart, has completely overflowed into the left ventricle of the heart and completely transformed, which is why David HaMelech said in Tehillim the words "V'libi chalal b'kirbi," my heart is empty within me, meaning that he had no more Yetzer Hara. He did not have the animal soul disturbing him. His animal soul was not an obstacle to his service of God. Okay, so that is the tzaddik. So the tzaddik absolutely has no desire whatsoever to sin in thought, speech, and action, because he's completely godly, all his actions are in alignment with the will of Hashem. The Rasha, on the other hand, is dominated by his animal soul. Now, in actual fact, Tanya refers to two different types of wicked people, two different types of Rasha, a complete Rasha and an incomplete Rasha, and I'll explain the difference in a moment. But the Rasha is dominated. He has not been able to break through the coarseness of his animal soul for the godly light of the divine soul to penetrate it and to be able to influence it. And there are two types of Rashaim. There is a complete Rasha and an incomplete Rasha, and basically the difference between the two is that one has remorse and one does not have remorse. So most people are not a complete Rasha. Even if we do have the possibility of sinning, most people have remorse and want to be able to do tshuva and want to be able to be influenced by their divine soul, by their godly soul, nefesh elokis, and live in alignment with their values. Okay, so that's the Rasha. Now here comes the Beinoni. Now Tanya is a guidebook for the Beinonim, the ones in between that are neither a tzaddik nor a Rasha. And truthfully, a lot of people will look at Tanya and say, well, this is not really for me. I don't think I could reach this level of being a Beinoni, because the level of a Beinoni is pretty lofty. The level of a Beinoni, mistakenly, most people think that what happens in a Beinoni is that really he has all of these desires and he kind of like controls them and he doesn't sin. That is not what a Beinoni is, actually. A Beinoni has reached a level of completely being free of conflict. A Beinoni, the Alter Rebbe tells us, does not sin in neither thought, speech, and action. So in actual fact, a Beinoni is extremely similar to a tzaddik. If you look at a Beinoni and a tzaddik from the outside, you won't see much of a difference between the two of them. You will see them acting actually in exactly the same way. A Beinoni does not even sin in thought. What does that mean that he doesn't sin in thought? He does not develop his involuntary thoughts that come from the animal soul. And that is the difference between a Beinoni and a tzaddik. A tzaddik does not even have involuntary thoughts stemming from the nefesh habahamis, from the animal soul, because his animal soul is in complete alignment with his godly soul. His animal soul will never be an obstacle to his service of Hashem in a tzaddik. In the Beinoni still has a active animal soul. His animal soul is active, but the way the animal soul works is that it starts off with an involuntary expression, an involuntary thought, an involuntary desire of pursuit of pleasure, of sinning, of going contrary to Hashem's will, and then the Rasha will develop that thought and will think, how should I do this? What should I do? How should I sin? The Beinoni, it's so momentary, it's a millisecond, and he completely squashes that thought. It doesn't even enter into his pure consciousness, and he's completely not conflicted and continues his life serving Hashem in the best way possible. And the reason why this is applicable to all of us is because we are able to reach that level. And if not completely, we are able to have what I like to call Beinoni moments where instead of doing what we want to do, in other words, what our animal soul is telling us to do, we put aside the desires of our animal soul and we act in alignment with the desires of our godly soul. So we can have Beinoni moments, and eventually we can become a Beinoni. We cannot become a tzaddik. The reasons why Tanya brings many examples of tzaddikim is not for us to become tzaddikim, but for us to learn from tzaddikim how to behave. But we can, according to Tanya, become a Beinoni. And if not completely we can have Beinoni moments, and the more Beinoni moments we have, the more often we have Beinoni moments, we can subjugate our animal soul to the will of Hashem. Okay. So again, the animal soul is not evil. It is not evil, even though sometimes it is identified as such. Okay. It's biological. It's found in our blood. It gives life to our body, and that's why it can sometimes fall into temptation. The animal soul is not essentially a thief or a liar, but sometimes expresses itself that way, okay, in order to survive. But our animal soul can be refined, educated, and elevated, and eventually can even become an ally of our divine soul. So in other words, the divine soul is what gives us our vision, what gives us our purpose in life, and the animal soul helps us implement it. That is why when I say that the animal soul becomes an ally to the divine soul, it's actually because if you really look at it, the Nefesh Elokis, our godly divine soul, needs our animal soul in order to perform mitzvahs in this world, which is an interesting point. So we can't just say, oh, I wish I didn't have this animal soul. I wish I wasn't like disturbed by all the desires and temptations of this world. Your divine soul, your Nefesh Elokis, needs your Nefesh Bahamis in order to perform mitzvahs. And the way that it does so is by permeating your animal soul with kedusha and transforming it to a level of kedusha, which it's able to do, since the source of it is klipas noiga and not complete klipa. Okay, so now going on to discuss the second soul. Now, every morning when you daven, we thank Hashem for our soul. So we say the most basic tefillah when we first wake up, and we say Moedeh ani lefanecha, and we thank Hashem for our soul. At that point, we haven't mentioned God's name, but then after we have washed our hands, we've washed Negelwasser, we continue saying the tefillah of Elokai, Neshama Shenasata Bi Tahirahi, and we say to Hashem, Hashem, this soul that you have given me is holy, Tahirahi. Ata barasa, you created it. Ata yatzarta, you have formed it. The ata nofachta bi, and you blew it into me. And this is a very important piece of information that we have about the godly soul, because the godly soul comes from a level of Hashem that's very, very deep. Hashem created the world, we know, through speech. Now, we can speak. I don't know about you, but I could speak for hours. Speak and speak and speak. You could get tired from speaking, but it takes much longer to get tired from speaking than it does to get tired from blowing. So if you want to try and blow and go, you're going to get tired, I don't know, after 2 minutes, 5 minutes, depending on your stamina, but you will get tired because blowing comes from a place much deeper within yourself. So here we know that all of creation was from Hashem's speech, from the level of God's speech. However, our soul, our godly soul, which is within us, comes from the level of breath. Hashem's breath that he blew into us. In actual fact, Tanya uses the words to explain to us what and where this godly soul comes from. The words come from, the words Tanya uses to describe is that it's a part of God itself. Chelek Eloka mima'al. It's a part of Hashem, Hashem himself. Now it's interesting, look at this word mima'al. The Hebrew word mima'al is mem ayin lamed. Now usually in Hebrew, the word al means on top of, right? Me'al means on top of what's on top. Mima'al is on top of what's on top of what's on top. So it really, really comes from a very, very high, elevated place. Now, this elevated place is considered to be the intellect of Hashem. It is not the speech, it's the intellect, because think about it. When you speak, before you speak, you have to think about what you're speaking, or at least we hope so, that you should think before you speak, right? Hashem's thought also becomes before his speech, and thought is connected to your brain, which is why, by the way, the godly soul is found primarily in the intellect of a person, which we are going to get into in the 3rd chapter of Tanya. We are now dealing with the 2nd chapter of Tanya. So the source of your soul is from the intellect of Hashem. Now, What's interesting is that your soul, in order to come into your body, goes through a very similar process of gestation of a child. So, for example, Tanya actually gives this example. When a child is born, the origin of this child is actually in the brain of the father. How does that work? The brain of the father had a thought. It all originates in thought, which which resulted into a drop of semen, which then fertilized the child in the body of the mother, which then went through a 9-month gestation, which formed the body of the child. So the origin of the child is in the brain of the father, and then develops into different parts of the body, which the child also has a brain, but the child also has eyes and a nose and a mouth and hands and feet and nails even, which are considered to be like the most lowly part of the body of the child. In much the same way, the soul of a person goes through a gestation. Now if we receive something directly from Hashem, we need it to be kind of like filtered, because otherwise we would not be able to tolerate it. The world wouldn't be able to tolerate it, and we would not be able to tolerate it. So it has to come down into this world through a system which Hashem actually calls Hishtalshelus. It's a system of creation. Everything basically follows the system. We will see next week, probably, when we discuss the structure of the soul. It also is the system. But although the soul originates in the brain of our Father, meaning the intellect of Hashem, it then goes through a gestation, meaning it passes through the 4 spiritual worlds, which are Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, which we will not go into now, the explanation of what each of those worlds are. And then they also have to pass through the 10 attributes, the 10 spheres. What happens is that then this soul comes into the world and expresses itself differently in different people. Different people have different souls. So we cannot say that we have the same kind of soul as a tzaddik, and that a Russia has the same kind of soul as a tzaddik. The origin of all the souls are the same, which is a part of God, chelek Eloka mimal. But coming down in this world, all these souls are affected differently by this descent, by the descent through the 4 worlds, through the 10 spheres. They're all affected differently, and that's why we have different people in this world. We have different people with different potentials, with different attributes, with different intellectual capacities, with different spiritual capacities, but we all have the same source. However, much as like in the body of the child, Bnei Yisrael are considered one body. Some of Bnei Yisrael are considered the brain of the body, such as tzaddikim, and the rest of us are considered the different parts of the body. And even the most lowly person in the entire nation of Israel, which would be compared to the nails of a baby, are essentially connected to the brain of the Father, which is Hashem. Now, what happens is, very interestingly enough, is that the second parak of Tanya discusses the importance of being connected to a tzaddik, and thereby being connected to our life source, which is Hashem, which is the source of our godly soul. Interestingly enough, when a child, if we take the example of a child, when a child is born, right? The child is born out of the mother's womb. Wow, it's obvious, it's apparent, the connection of the child to the brain of the father. You see a mother, you see a father, they have a baby, mazel tov, you know that they're the parents, there's a connection. As a child grows and develops through life, that connection is not as apparent. In fact, when you meet somebody, you don't know who their parents are. You don't know where they come from. And in fact, you may have very holy parents who then have children who go on to do very bad things, and vice versa. You may have very lowly people who give birth to children who may do very lofty things and change the world, right? It does not remain apparent, the connection between the father and the child, because the child has changed. The child has been affected by the world. The child has, in essence, concealed its connection through development to its father. Now, in a tzaddik's connection to Hashem never changes. It's never changing. It's always constant, which is why we can utilize our connection to the tzaddik in order to reveal our connection to Hashem, which is the source of our neshama. We have an animal soul. We all have animal souls. Our animal souls by nature conceal godliness unless we really work on them with tools that we're going to learn from Tanya. But our nature, our instinct is concealing godliness. One of the ways out of that is to connect to a tzaddik who has not undergone any transformation whatsoever, in his connection to Hashem, and we kind of piggyback on that connection to connect to Hashem. It actually enables us to connect easier to Hashem. We also need to connect to a tzaddik, that's besides the point, but that enables us to connect to Hashem in a easier way. Okay, the godly soul is what actually makes a person Jewish. So what we have in connection with non-Jews, we have in common actually with non-Jews, is that we all have a life force, we all have an animal soul, but in a Jew, we have that extra advantage, which is our godly soul. The godly soul, the reason why we have that extra advantage is because we actually have more responsibility in this world to transform this world to become a dwelling place for God. We are going to be finishing up soon. Okay, one more thing that I will say before we finish is that the type of soul that we are given does not depend on us. The type of soul that we are given actually comes from Hashem. Hashem gifts us this soul, but the garments of the soul are given as a present to our children by our thoughts during conception of the soul. Why this is so is because we know that the soul has three garments, which are thought, speech, and action. Thought is the garment which is closest to the soul and most affects the soul, which is why what we think at the time of conception affects the garments of the soul. Now, the garments of the soul later on, we could always change them, we can always affect them, but we can always give our children a step up, an advantage by what we think at the time of conception. And that is also in the second parak of Tanya. Okay, I will just take 1 second. Okay. Are there any questions? If you have a question, you can unmute yourself. Any questions? Whoever is saying something, I cannot hear you. In order to say something, you have to unmute yourself.
I just have a practical question that this is a lot to digest. Like you're like a powerhouse, which I absolutely love. Is it okay if we when we go over it, if we have questions in the WhatsApp?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no, I just want to make sure that whatever I've taught is clear. That's basically my point now. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can digest and discuss and interact on the WhatsApp group. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. So if that's all for today.
Hannah?
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you again. When you speak, for me to understand and integrate, I usually type as much as I can put down. Can I put those notes on the chat?
For sure. That would be great, actually.
I think that we all are writing notes. So if we all write notes and they all go on the chat.
Well, it's in a document, so you can either open the document or not.
Oh, okay, amazing.
It's a document, it's not just.
So you're a real note taker, not like me.
Right. I mean, it's just how I process my thoughts. So I just try to type what's coming in and coming out, and it goes in a document and the whole document. So you can either open it or not.
Amazing, amazing.
Okay.
Thank you. It will also be nice to see it from your perspective, even though, we learn from Hannah, but we can also learn from each other.
Well, for me, when I do that, then I print it out. And then on Shabbos, when I have more time in my head, whatever classes I've been in, I print them out and then I can review them. And then because I can't remember a whole week what happened.
I actually think it's a great thing because the goal of this class is not only to remain inspired, but to actually take that inspiration and turn it into action. And one of the ways to do that, as we're going to see in Tanya, is to meditate and reflect and chew it over and review it until it becomes actually part of you. And that's the process of Chachma, Bina, and Das. So Chachma is the information, Bina is the understanding and the chewing it over and the meditating and reflecting upon, and Das is actually when it becomes part of you. So I like that idea.
Can I say a 1-minute story about the Beinani?
Sure.
My husband is good friends with Itcha de Masmed's grandson. And Itcha de Masmed was known as a Beinani. The Rebbe called him a Beinani. So his grandson was a little boy, and he said, Zayda, how can you be a Beinani? So he explained it the way he explained it to a child, and it's something easy for us to understand. He told him, he said to him, when you're busy helping your mother, you're being a Beinani for that second. And then if right afterwards you go and say to him, you're being a Beinani for that second. And then afterwards, if you go and help your friend, you're being a Beinani for that second. So all you have to do is make sure to connect those incidences. So that's how he explained it to a little boy.
Right. We are all potential Beinanis, and like I like to call it Beinani moments, you know.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anna.
Okay, everybody.
Laura,
Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Have a great day. We'll speak on the WhatsApp group, and we'll see each other next week. Please go on.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.